Let's talk.
Charles Brown.
A Measure Short of War is a brief history of the Great Power Subversion. A short history of the Great Power Subversion is a fast-paced, gripping history of meddling, manipulation, and skullduggery among great power rivals. One of my favourite words of ever. It's written by William C. Warforth and Jill Kastner. I says that Jill joins me live on the line now. Jill, good morning to you.
Good morning, Giles.
Whereabouts are you, by the way, on the planet today, or can you not reveal that fact because you're into manipulation and meddling at the moment?
Yeah, I can't tell you. I'd have to kill you. I'm just outside of London.
Super. Skullduggery. I think that's a word. I think that's a word we don't hear enough of these days, and I think it's one that we should be bringing back to the general populace.
Well, I think that's going to happen. I think given the way the world is, there'll be more and more of it, and that's one of the reasons that we wrote this book, is to elevate the idea of subversion and skullduggery to a new respectability, might be the wrong word, but to a new awareness in the public.
Either a new high or plumbing to new depths. Now, tell me a little bit. Tell me a little bit about yourself and how. And I will phrase this in the most polite way I can. Why you are sort of eminently qualified to write this book on deception and meddling and skullduggery.
Well, look, I studied the Cold War for a very long time. I was kind of an academic nerd. I did a PhD in history, and I've been looking at this for a long time, and my co-author, we didn't know each other in 2016, but we were sitting on either side of the Atlantic watching the American reaction to the Russian election meddling, which was febrile, to say the least. There was a lot of screaming headlines and hand-wringing and, the American Committee to Investigate Russia and a public service announcement with Morgan Freeman saying, "We are at war." And Bill and I were looking at this situation and going, well, what's everybody talking about? This has been happening forever. Anybody who's looked at the Cold War and before would know that this is nothing unusual. And so this idea that we were in a new age of subversion was somehow upsetting to us. And so we decided to go out and have a look and do a little study and see if we were in a new age of subversion. What does that mean? Was there an old age? Did it go away? Did it come back? So that's what prompted the book.
So subversion, for those who don't know what we're talking about, and let's be honest, when I'm on the radio, most of the population don't, but there you go. But what is the art of subversion?
Well, to think about the art, you have to first think about a definition. And This is what we started with. And that's really important because there's a lot of wonderful scholarship out there about covert action and election meddling and disinformation and active measures. It's all this stuff. But subversion needs to be tamed underneath just the umbrella title of subversion, because it's actually a tool of statecraft, like diplomacy or balancing or war. So if we elevate it to that and think about it as a tool of statecraft, then we can think about how states would use it and how to defend against it. So the definition that we have is that it's hostile, unwanted action on the territory of the rival with the intent of weakening that rival or changing their foreign policy somehow. And to break that down, it's important that it be hostile. So covert action to prop up a government is not subversion. It needs to be on the territory of the rival. So diplomacy and economic pressure, these things are also intended to shift foreign policies of countries, but they take place outside the sovereign boundaries of the country. And this is important because action that's on the territory, it has a different psychological impact. So think about the horror movie where the protagonist realizes that the call is coming from inside the house. That's what subversion does to a population. So it seeks effects, and that's important because that means it's not espionage. So a lot of times when you see stories and writing about espionage, or there's a spy break, or there's some sort of hack, that's not subversion. It's only subversion if it seeks effects. So stealing information is one thing. That's espionage. Stealing information and releasing it, like they did in 2016, for a political effect, that's subversion.
Right.
So that's the definition we have.
And obviously we tend to think that this is all newfangled, Cold War at least, but this goes back millennia even. I mean, this is something that the ancients were getting up to. What was the first sort of one that made you sit up and go, hang on a second, that Trojan horse looks a bit subversive? I mean, what was from the annals of the ancients that made you sort of sit up and take notice?
Look, there's a very now famous book by Graham Allison called The Thucydides Trap, which posits that when you have a rising power, you have a dominant power and a rising power, they're going to go to war because they're afraid of each other's power. So we started by looking at that Athens and Sparta. And you can see that it was that Sparta was afraid of Athenian subversion. And Thucydides has a bit in some of his writing where he talks about their fear of the Athenians coming and sparking an uprising among the Helot population, the fifth column, before there were fifth columns. And the way that the ancient world worked, subversive activity was baked into the political system. So in those Greek city-states, they were always exiling people when they got into trouble. And often those exiles would come back and want to overthrow the government of the state from which they had been banished. And they almost always did that in cahoots with one of the big powers of the day, so with Athens or Sparta or Persia. And in the ancient world, they also had this role of proxenos, which was kind of the opposite of a diplomat. So this would be a prominent citizen, usually wealthy, in a city-state who would be the representative of another state. So, for instance, you could be the proxenos of Sparta in Athens. You'd be an Athenian statesman, and you would also have some loyalty and some ties to Sparta. And there's a lot of evidence that, not only were they sort of diplomatic representatives, they were also getting up to intelligence gathering and clandestine activities like helping out with coups and assassinations and doing all sorts of things. And so the ancient world is rife with examples of this. In fact, a lot more than you see in the modern world. This is one of the things that really surprised us. When we went back 2,000 years and moved it forward, it turned out that, not only are we not in a new age of subversion, there's actually a lot less of it now than there used to be compared to our ancestors. There's a lot more war. Yeah,
I suppose the thing is, political assassinations and stabbing people in the back and around about March is kind of frowned on. Even in the primaries, you'd say you can't get away with that these days.
Yeah. Well, that's a function of the porous nature of those Greek city-states, and they just didn't have the same protections. They didn't have the same technology. That it's a natural thing to expect.
And it's interesting thing about those, being sort of a diplomatic, in a different place, because we tend to think of the ancient world of this block is Persia, this block is Rome, this block is Greece, but actually there were little city-states all over the place, and so there was always incredibly porous. So there was shifting, and someone like Sicily gets like battered around like a paddle tennis ball, and so no wonder that people are, because at one side, one day you're on Carthage side, and the next day you're on the Greek side, and who knows what's going on. So that's subterfuge at its finest.
Yes, and because they were so small and the leadership really mattered, if you lopped off the head of the leader, put somebody else in there, you could shift from one alliance to the next quite easily because it was small, and that was the way of the world at that time.
Let's sort of dial it forward a little bit, because I want to get into the sort of our modern bit. But I just want to talk about, because I've got, as you can probably tell from my outfit today, I've got to think about ruffs and the Elizabethans, and we think about, Queen Elizabeth I and Walsingham, for example, which is a name that many of us will prick up our ears here and go, oh, wonderful. I mean, is that, we have the privateer, otherwise known in these parts of Spain as the pirate Drake, who is singeing beards from Cadiz to Bilbao. But what is it that is it Walsingham? Is it sort of those behind the arras, as Shakespeare would write? I mean, are there whispered subterfuges going on through royal courts and courtiers?
Yes, well, it's perfect that we talk about that since you're sitting in Spain. But the rivalry between Elizabeth I and Philip II of Spain is one of my favorite chapters of the book, because you've got this 40-year competition between the two of them, and you can watch how things deteriorate over the course of those 40 years. So when they first knew each other, Philip was married to Elizabeth's half-sister, and he was the titular king of Spain, and Mary was the queen, and Elizabeth was sort of stuck in a jail somewhere. And so when Mary died, suddenly Elizabeth was the queen, the country went Protestant, Philip lost the crown of England, and he lost England for the Habsburgs in the war against France, and he lost a country to the Protestants. So it was a big problem for Philip. But for the first 10 years, it was all about diplomacy, marriage diplomacy. He didn't really want to marry her, but he was trying to get his cousin to. And they went on and on over this for about 10 years. That began to break down. But instead of declaring war immediately, because it was expensive, and this is the thing, wars are expensive. An invasion of England was tricky. Philip was stretched financially. And so the subversive aspect began to creep into it more and more. So there were rebellions. There was the Northern Rebellion. There was the Rodolphi plot. You had the Pope with the papal bulls declaring Elizabeth a heretic, and you had these various plots to overthrow her and marry some sort of Catholic or particularly Spanish person to her cousin, who was Mary Queen of Scots, who was Catholic and then in England. So that went on, and it just never could solve the problem. Sometimes subversion can solve the problem. It can kick the can down the road, or it can get a gain that then makes the issue go away. But between Philip and Elizabeth, it was never going to solve the problem. So by the time they got to the end of it, they ended up going to war because subversion was not able to resolve that problem. Walsingham is really important because the reason Elizabeth was able to not succumb to all of those plots was because he was really good at what he did. He had a great intelligence network, superb. And between that and the English Channel and the increasing wealth of England as they began to get things from the New World, they were able to hold things off until 1588 and beat the Armada when it finally arrived.
Yeah, fascinating stuff indeed. I do like Walsingham. He's such a fascinating character, and the network he's got. And this is even today with our communications network, you'd be hard pressed to beat Walsingham because he had little birds everywhere, as the saying goes.
Good cryptography as well. And, excellent networks. Really good.
Let's go forward a bit. Here we go. My anorak's coming on again. 1870. I think, hang on, let me get a minute. 1870, the Iron Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Now, to me, this is sort of the start of the modern age, if you will. He's unified Germany, which is a work in itself, to put it mildly. All those little patchwork quilt bishoprics and principalities all around the place, and then he decides to have a pop at the French because why not? So how does he sort of subterfuge and basically kickstart a war against the French?
Well, our focus was on what he did after the war.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, so come on then.
On what he did afterwards. I'm sure there was a lot of that going on before the war.
Yeah.
But after the war, after the French had lost, there was a Republican government in Paris, and Bismarck really wanted to make sure that Republican government stayed in place because there was talk of having a monarchy again, and a monarchy was very, very powerful. And Bismarck was afraid that if there were a monarchy in Paris, they would try and fight to get Alsace back, and they would try and overturn the gains of the war. And so at several points between sort of 1873 and 1877, he instigated these what they call the war in sight crises, where there would be an election, there would be a political movement, and he would secretly pay for newspaper articles for clandestine agents in Paris. He had a propaganda and disinformation campaign going in order to convince the French public that electing or choosing a monarchy would result in a war with Germany. And it was incredibly successful. And it was he was really good at this. And he had all this money from the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. He had this huge fund it was called the Guelph Fund, but we all call it the Reptile Fund. And, it was a vast sum. Somebody calculated what it is in today's dollars. It was like several $100 million of this money to pay for agents and to pay for news articles. And because there had been a change in the tax situation with print, this is really archaic, but with newsprint and with journals, there was an explosion of printed news in the 19th century, and that really fed into that because all of a sudden you had the equivalent of tabloid journalism that hadn't existed before, and he really took advantage of that, and he was successful. He prevented a monarchical government, not single-handedly, but subversion is a bit like it's like being a farmer. You want to grow a crop, and you've got your dirt, and you've got your water, and you've got your sunshine, you've got your fertilizer, which might be the subversive stuff, the disinformation. You don't know which is the most powerful, but you know that it has some kind of effect, and that's what Bismarck was able to do.
Do you just sort of sit back on the front porch then and see it grow quietly while smiling to yourself and having, getting another cup of coffee? Yeah. Yes. Interesting you should mention media though, because this is what really turbocharges, I suppose, subversive acts. I mean, we talk about newsprint in the 19th century, and then of course there's radio, which FDR uses, the fireside chats. He uses that for propaganda, or for turns the whole of the states around. And in Germany, and I won't go down my usual Third Reich rabbit hole, but one of the main things is that every household in Germany's got a very small radio, and Goebbels uses that to a tremendous effect for propaganda. So, in subversion, you take the new technology. You can see where I'm going with this, can't you? You take the new technology, don't you? You stay ahead of the latest developments to get to the people that matter, or just to change the public opinion.
Well, new technology opens up new avenues for subversion, and that's just the way it is. It's an exogenous shock to the equilibrium of the system whenever it is. So we can focus on radio. In the 30s, I think, is when it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And yes, Roosevelt used it to great effect domestically, as did the Germans. And all of them were worried about propaganda from foreign sources on their own soil because radio had this reach. It really predates the internet age. It had this reach across the border. You could get into someone else's sovereign territory without putting a human being, an expensive, fallible, ridiculous human being in there to do your bidding. So the House Un-American Activities Committee, for instance, was founded in 1934 to investigate German propaganda in America. And the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is still in place today, which they use to nail people when they're working clandestinely for a foreign government, was signed into effect by Roosevelt as a result of that. So German propaganda, radio included, had a big impact on that. But that wasn't just in the 30s. You could dial that back and look at the invention of the printing press, for instance. The Protestant Reformation wouldn't have happened without the printing press. All of a sudden, people could print stuff, these little pamphlets, and distribute it in ways that had never happened before. And it was a huge subversive moment for the Catholic Church, which then was able eventually to have a law that said the Catholic Church got to approve everything that was ever printed. So you can see where this is going, and it also then leads into the early 21st century.
Because this is a thing, and I'm glad you brought that point up, because that's the point I bring up, because basically we are in the age of modern pamphleteers. Because if you've got a printing press, or if you've got a website, or you've got social media, you can put what the bleeding hell you want out there, pretty much so, and go, if you want to say that the world is run by a cabal of 12-foot subterranean hamsters called Nigel with blonde hair, you will be able to put that, and you will find a website that says the world is run by a subterranean cabal of blonde hamsters called Nigel. I mean, that is the pamphleteers, isn't it? Exactly. And people say, well, I've seen it here. Look, there's a website that says, here's a picture of Nigel himself. But this is the age that we're living in, Jill. Sorry, yes. I know it's a serious project, but I may have made that point before quite strenuously too.
Yes, well, yes. What was your point again? You got me laughing.
Saying that the internet. So people are saying, "Oh, well, the internet. We've never had a problem like that." But saying that pamphleteers and the printing press and the coffee houses of, we're getting serious again now, of 18th century London. This is the forebear of what we have now with the internet. But it's social media, as we have seen in recent years, because we've only got about 10 minutes left. In recent years, has been, take Subversion and dial up to 11 because nobody's checking and people can put what and pretty much what they want online.
Yes. Okay. So that feeds into this idea of a tech panic. And a tech panic has been happening since Socrates got upset because people started writing down their oratory instead of memorizing it. He wrote about that. He was worried it was going to destroy people's minds. So you get that pushback panic with the radio. They thought it was also going to destroy young people's minds, with the fax machine, which was actually invented in the 19th century, with television, with everything that has ever come along. And so it's kind of a rat brain human reaction to new tech. We freak out a little, and we tend to see the worst of it instead of the best because that's protective for us. So just put that there. The trick is that technology is always a double-edged sword. So if you use it to subvert, if you use it to attack, then the target is always going to use the same technology to defend. So social media, you've got all these raucous voices back and forth for every idea. You've got a counter idea, and that kind of balances each other out. We get upset because there's just so much noise, and we worry about what it's going to do to us. But if we look at the long arc of history, we really probably should take a deep breath and realize that the sky's not going to fall, and we're going to be okay.
With the use of subversion as an aggressive, so because you can defend against subversion as well, but presumably if you are a totalitarian stroke authoritarian state, it is easier to engage in subversion because you don't have the democratic principles and then the checks and balances that stop you doing this sort of thing. So there was this shock horror that a cyber attacks come out of former Soviet Union or from somewhere in the Chinese or something like this. Should we, because they can devote a huge amount of manpower and technology in a way that a Western quote unquote democracy cannot.
Yes, that is true. It is easier for them to give it a go. They don't have to worry about leadership changes and policy changes every 4 or 5 years like democracies do. They can command large amounts of cash and resources and human beings to dedicate themselves to this. But having said that, it's important to remember that democracies are a lot more robust than we sometimes give them credit for. They have strong institutions. They have, intelligence and domestic policing institutions, good communications, patriotism. Patriotism is really strong. The minute there's a whiff of a foreign hand, people will usually rally together and get over that. So it's important to remember that democracies are more robust and autocracies are actually quite brittle. So we get scared. We think it's, Putin is the 3D chess playing genius, but an autocracy can be quite brittle, and often you don't know that it's going to collapse until just before it does. So I just put that out there.
2 words, Mark Carney. That's all I'm going to say about that, about people being intensely patriotic. Yeah, I do a phone-in show. Trust me, it's been rather lively. So when it comes to writing about this, Jill, how do you find it? Because by its very nature, a lot of it is secretive. You're not going to say, oh yes, actually, we know the guy behind Real Pillow was in fact born in Vladivostok and he's been a sleeper agent all these years. So how do you actually find out information about this? Is a lot of it coming declassified, or are there sort of actions that you can go, yeah, that follows a certain pattern?
Well, 2 things. There's one reason that so much of the scholarship is focused on the Cold War, and that's because there's so much paperwork that's come out from the declassification of files in the Cold War. So that's why there's a skew towards writing about covert ops and all the stuff that's going on in the Cold War. So that's great. But for a modern researcher, it's heaven compared to what it was 40 years ago. The internet is just completely wonderful. You can go in, you've got really good reporting for 2016, for instance, from the Washington Post. From books that were written afterwards. You can interview people who were there. We did a lot of interviews for this book, Jake Sullivan and various people who were kind of on the ground paying attention. And it's not rocket science. And because it's not espionage related, you can kind of figure it out and connect the dots. It doesn't need to be unclassified in order to figure out what's happening. And there's a lot of good coverage out there.
So what would you say to people who are perhaps are worried about this, the peddling of foreign influence? Is it sort of get informed, don't believe everything you kind of see, but don't overreact and don't underreact?
Well, yeah, it is to remember that the sky is not falling, and to think about the idea. That's one reason we wrote this book, is that we need to defend against it. From 30,000 feet as a researcher, I think subversion it's completely neutral, right? It's not good, it's not bad. It's a tool of statecraft. Everybody uses it. We do, they do, everybody does. But as a citizen of the U.S. and the U.K., I really don't like other countries meddling in the processes of my countries. Darn it. So, people need to be reminded that they can fight back. The entire cybersecurity industry really is about trying to convince individuals to do the right thing, to use their 2-factor authentication and to shut the door and to power down their computer, basic stuff. So, in the world of spies, lies, and sabotage, we need to raise our own game personally, and then that protects us against this sort of meddling, which is always going to happen. We shouldn't freak out about it. It's there. It's just up to us to defend against it. What
are you hoping that the casual reader will learn, discover, and become informed about by your book, A Measure Short of War?
Oh, well, I hope the casual reader will realize that they too have a role to play in protecting all of us from all of this, and that they might pick up a few really fun anecdotes for a great dinner party if they're going to have a discussion about subversion and spycraft. Okay,
so you just said fun anecdote and dinner party. It's a national holiday today for those of us who who have such things. Is there sort of a recent anecdote from the world of subterfuge that made you literally sort of stop and laugh out loud, apart from obviously the 12-foot subterranean hamsters called Nigel with blonde hair?
Are those subversive hamsters?
Yes,
Not
indeed.
Sure. Well, this doesn't make me laugh out loud, but I've got my mind very much on sabotage. And, you guys had a massive power blackout, right? And there's no...
Just a little bit. Just a little bit, yeah. God, yeah. I tell you.
There's no indication that was sabotage, but it shows you how vulnerable critical infrastructure can be. And so as Europe is more and more required to stand on its own now, given where the U.S. is and given Russia, we need to keep our eyes open. Last year saw a lot of incidents of sabotage, incendiary devices on airplanes, and problems with the cables in the Baltic, and warehouse fires in Poland and in the UK. So that's going to happen more and more, I think. And so it's important for all of us to just keep our eyes open, get our heads out of our cell phones and look around and be aware of what's going on.
The book is called A Measure Short of War, A Brief History of the Great Power Subversion. You can order it via our own virtual bookstore. Just go onto the virtual bookstore on TRE.radio, click on the book, and it'll be winging its way to you. It is by William C. Wolford and Jill Kastner, who is speaking to you today. Jill, if people want to find you online and say very nice things to you, where's the best place to go?
Say it again.
If people want to find you online, I was doing so well.
Find me online.
Yes.
Find me online.
Yes.
I'm on LinkedIn. They can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the safest space.
I would think so as well. The book is called A Measure Short of War. It's by William C. Wolford and Jill Kastner. Jill, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you, Giles. It's been fun.